Nobody noticed when Elias Vann walked into a room. That was simply the truth of his life, and he had accepted it the way a person accepts rain. Not happily, but without much surprise. He was 23 years old, thin-shouldered, with quiet brown eyes that always seemed to be watching something the rest of the world had already decided was not worth looking at. He lived in a small room at the edge of the lower district, where the streets were narrow and the buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. Every morning, he woke up before the sun, made himself a simple meal, and walked to the outer fields where he was permitted to work, carrying, sorting, moving things from one place to another. It was not glamorous, it was not even particularly meaningful, but it was what a rank zero was allowed to do, and Elias had been a rank zero his entire life. The ranking system had been in place for over 300 years in the kingdom of Aldenmore. It was the structure that held everything together, or so the people in power always said. At the top sat the Alpha King, a position that had passed through bloodlines, battles, and sheer force of will. Below him were the high-ranked nobles, generals, healers, and commanders. Below them were the craftsmen, traders, and farmers. And at the very bottom, barely considered part of the system at all, were the rank zeros. They had no designation, no title, and no future. They were simply the people that the world had measured and found too light to matter. Elias had been measured twice, once as a child and once at 18, when young men were officially assigned their ranks. Both times, the outcome was the same. The old evaluators had looked at him, run their standard tests, and marked him down without ceremony. He remembered the second time clearly. The evaluator had not even looked up from his paper when he said, "Rank 0, next." Elias had stood there for a moment, wondering if there was something else to say. There was not. He had walked out into a gray afternoon and gone home. What the evaluators could not measure, what no test had ever been designed to find, was what lived quietly inside Elias Vann. He had a way with people that he himself did not fully understand. When someone near him was in pain, he felt it before they spoke. When two men were close to an argument, he always seemed to say the one small thing that softened the air between them. Animals trusted him immediately. Children walked up to him on the street without being told to. Old people in the lower district saved him the good seat by the window when he came to visit, because somehow the room felt calmer when he was in it. But none of those things had a number attached to them, and in Aldenmore, if something could not be numbered, it was not considered real. The choosing was announced on the first morning of the harvest season, just as it had been every decade for as long as anyone could remember. Large banners appeared on the walls of the upper city, and the town criers walked every street, even the lower ones, even the narrow one where Elias lived. The Alpha King would be present in the Grand Hall in 7 days. Every citizen between the ages of 18 and 30 was required to attend. The chosen one would serve as the king's personal ward for a period of 5 years. A role that had always gone to someone strong, decorated, and well-connected. It was, in every practical sense, a ceremony designed for people who were nothing like Elias. He almost did not go. He stood at the door of his small room on the morning of the 7th day, his hand on the latch, and genuinely considered staying behind. Nobody would have missed him. Nobody had ever particularly missed him anywhere. But something shifted in his chest, some quiet pull he could not name, and he put on his cleanest shirt, which was still quite plain, and walked toward the Grand Hall with the rest of the city. The hall was enormous. Elias had only seen it from the outside before, and the inside was even more overwhelming. High ceilings, stone columns carved with the names of past kings, and hundreds of people packed into every available space. The high-ranked men stood near the front in their uniforms and decorations. The craftsmen and traders filled the middle. The rank zeros, the few who had come, gathered near the back, half behind a pillar. Elias stood among them, partly hidden, and watched the front of the room. King Caelum Dray entered without announcement. He simply appeared, and the room changed. He was tall and broad, with a stillness about him that was somehow more commanding than noise. He wore no crown that day, just dark clothing, simple and well-made. His face was expressionless, not cold exactly, but contained, the way deep water looks calm from the surface. He walked to the center of the hall, stood still, and let his eyes move slowly across the crowd. Everyone straightened. Even Elias, who had no reason to feel nervous, felt his breath slow. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The king's gaze moved from the decorated front rows back through the middle crowd, then further, past the craftsmen, past the tradespeople, all the way to the back of the hall, where the light was thinner and the people were plainer. His eyes continued moving, and then they stopped. They stopped on Elias. Elias looked to his left, then to his right. The men beside him had both taken a small step back, as if to make it absolutely clear they were not the one being looked at. When he looked forward again, the king was still watching him. Not the pillar, not the general area. Him, specifically, with a steady and certain gaze. King Caelum walked forward. The crowd parted without being asked, the way water moves around something that does not slow down. He passed the generals. He passed the nobles. He passed men who had trained their whole lives for this moment. Men who had paid for fine clothing and polished medals. Men who had rehearsed the things they would say if the king ever looked in their direction. He passed all of them. He walked the full length of the grand hall, and he stopped in front of Elias Vann. For one long moment, neither of them spoke. The king looked at him, not evaluating exactly, but recognizing, the way you recognize something you have been searching for, without quite knowing what it was. Then he spoke, quietly enough that the front rows could not hear, but clearly enough that the people near the back could. "You," he said. "I choose you." And then the hall collapsed into noise. The uproar was immediate. Voices rose from every direction. Confusion, disbelief, and a sharp, undisguised outrage from the nobles near the front. Several of the high-ranked men looked at each other with expressions that said clearly, "This is a mistake. Surely this is a mistake." A general near the front actually stepped forward and opened his mouth, as if to correct the king. One look from Caelum closed it again. Elias did not move. He was not certain his legs would carry him if he tried. He stood very still in the middle of all that noise and looked at the king, who was watching him calmly, waiting. Elias thought, with unusual clarity, that this was either the most important moment of his life or that he was somehow still asleep. He decided, eventually, that it did not matter which. He straightened his back, met the king's eyes, and gave a small, honest nod. The king nodded back, and that was that. Outside the hall, as the crowd poured into the streets, the story spread faster than fire. By that evening, everyone in Aldenmore knew the Alpha King had chosen a rank 0, not a general, not a nobleman, not a decorated warrior or a celebrated healer. A boy from the lower district who carried things for a living. The reactions were exactly what you would expect. The powerful were insulted, the middle ranks were bewildered, and the lower district, the narrow streets, the tired buildings, the people who had always been told they were too light to matter, went very, very quiet. Not a sad quiet, a different kind. The kind that comes just before something changes. Elias moved into the king's citadel 3 days later, carrying one bag, which did not take long to pack. He was given a room larger than his entire previous home, which he found slightly uncomfortable at first. He was given access to the library, the training halls, the meeting rooms, and the long corridors where the king's advisors moved back and forth all day, with urgent expressions and important papers. No one was quite sure what to do with him. He did not fit any of the categories they had prepared, so Elias simply did what he had always done. He paid attention. He listened more than he spoke. He learned the name of every person who passed him in the corridor. The advisors, the guards, the kitchen workers, the young messengers who ran between buildings with folded notes. He remembered what they told him about their lives. He asked questions that nobody had thought to ask before. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing, things began to shift. The first thing people noticed was the mood in the citadel. Meetings that had previously ended in argument began producing decisions. Two advisors who had not spoken directly to each other in years found themselves, somehow, in a room with Elias between them, and left the room having reached an agreement. A young soldier who had been struggling badly after an injury recovered faster than his physician expected, and the physician later admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that the soldier had seemed unusually calm, that Elias had visited him every day, and they had talked, and that whatever was said in those visits seemed to do something that medicine alone had not managed. King Caelum watched all of this without comment. He was not a man who spoke unless he had something worth saying, and he was patient in the way that only very powerful people can afford to be. He had known, from the moment his eyes found Elias in the back of the grand hall, that he had not made a mistake. He had spent 30 years surrounded by strength, measuring it, commanding it, being tested by it. And he had learned something that none of his evaluators had ever been able to quantify. Strength without integrity eventually turns on itself. Every powerful man who had failed him had done so not because they lacked ability, but because something inside them had already been corrupted before they ever reached him. Elias was different. The king had known it the instant he saw him. Not because Elias was special in the ways the world rewarded, but because he was completely, entirely, almost impossibly uncorrupted. He had been given every reason to become bitter, and had chosen, quietly and without drama, not to be. That was rarer than any rank, rarer than any title. It was, in the king's long experience, the rarest thing alive. Not everyone saw it that way. A group of powerful lords, men who had held influence in the kingdom for generations, grew increasingly unsettled as weeks passed, and the king showed no sign of reversing his decision. They had built their lives around the idea that rank was everything, that position determined worth, that power was the only reliable measure of a person. Elias, simply by existing where he existed, was a question they did not want asked, and so they decided to answer it themselves. They arranged a formal challenge. It was dressed up in legal language and presented as a matter of protocol, a review of the choosing to ensure it had been conducted properly. But everyone who read it understood what it really was: an attempt to expose Elias as unworthy, to embarrass the king publicly, and to restore the order that had held the powerful in their comfortable positions for 300 years. The hearing was held in the same grand hall where the choosing had taken place. Elias stood before the assembled lords and their advocates, who took turns presenting evidence of his lowly background, his poor rank, his lack of training, his absence of notable achievement. They were thorough and precise. They were also, though they did not realize it, describing the wrong things entirely. When it was Elias's turn to speak, he did not argue. He did not defend himself with numbers or records. He stood quietly, the way he always stood, and he told the truth in simple words. He talked about the soldier who had recovered, about the advisors who had finally spoken to each other, about the kitchen worker, whose name every lord in the room had passed a dozen times without once asking. He did not say any of it to impress anyone. He said it because it was what had happened, and the truth seemed like the right thing to offer. The room was very still when he finished. The lords had come prepared for a fight. They had not come prepared for honesty. One by one, the men who had organized the challenge found that they had very little left to say. Not because Elias had defeated them with cleverness or power, but because the contrast between what they had been doing and what he had been doing was now visible to everyone in the room, and no amount of legal language could make it invisible again. The lead lord called for a recess. They did not return. In the months that followed, the kingdom changed, not all at once, and not without resistance, but genuinely and deeply, in ways that could not be undone. The king commissioned a formal review of the ranking system, the first in the history of Aldenmore. The review took 8 months and interviewed hundreds of people, including many from the lower districts, who had never before been asked for their opinion on anything. The final report recommended the complete restructuring of how worth was measured, and the king accepted every recommendation. The designation of rank 0 was formally removed from the system. In its place came something new, a category called unranked potential, which acknowledged simply that some gifts took longer to find, and that the failure to find them early was a failure of the system, not of the person. New evaluation methods were introduced. New paths were created for people who were good at things that had never previously been considered valuable. People from the lower district began coming forward with skills they had hidden for years, quietly, at first, and then with increasing confidence, as they saw that the world was not going to punish them for it. A woman who had been healing her neighbors with plant remedies for 2 decades was finally given a formal position. An old man who had been quietly mediating disputes in the lower streets, with extraordinary success, was invited to advise on a regional conflict that trained diplomats had been unable to resolve. Small things, perhaps, in the long history of a kingdom. But real. Elias himself never sought any of it. He did not campaign for the changes or present himself as a symbol of anything. He continued doing what he had always done, paying attention, learning names, asking questions, and being present in the quiet, steady way that had always been his nature. The king gave him a formal title eventually, Counselor of Human Worth. It was a new title, created for a new kind of role, because there was no existing title that quite covered what Elias actually did. Years later, when people wrote about the reign of King Caelum Dray, they wrote about the battles he won, and the policies he changed, and the treaties he signed. But the thing they came back to most often, the thing that separated his reign from every other in the long history of Aldenmore, was a single morning in the Grand Hall, when he had walked past every powerful person in the room, and stopped in front of the one person nobody else had looked at twice. Historians debated what had guided him. Some said it was instinct, some said it was wisdom, some said it was simply good fortune. King Caelum himself, on the few occasions he was asked directly, gave the same answer every time. He said that in a room full of people competing to be seen, Elias was the only one who was not competing at all. He was simply there, fully, quietly, genuinely there. And in 30 years of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him, that was the most extraordinary thing the king had ever encountered. Elias, for his part, never quite got used to being recognized in the street. He still walked the same way he always had. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily, with his eyes open. People greeted him now. They remembered his name, which had once been the kind of name that nobody remembered. Children pointed him out to their parents, and parents said, "Yes, that is him," and let the moment mean what they needed it to mean. He still visited the lower district regularly. The narrow streets, the leaning buildings, the small rooms where people lived plain and honest lives. He found it easier to breathe there, in some ways. He would sit by the window in the old gathering place, and people would bring him tea, and they would talk about the kinds of things that did not appear in official reports. How they were sleeping, what they were worried about, what small thing had gone right that week. He listened to all of it. He always had. The world had changed around him in ways that were large and documented, and would be studied for generations. But what Elias Vann had done, at the very center of all of it, was nothing more and nothing less than exactly what he had always done. He had shown up. He had paid attention. He had treated every person he encountered as someone worth the time it took to know them. He had never once hardened himself against a world that had given him every reason to. And that, in the end, was the thing that changed everything.